apology. Today's share will be maybe somewhat a bit shorter because I have a very busy day and it's late in the morning. So this week is Parshas Toldos, and we start to learn the story of Yaakov and Esav. In the previous Parshas, primarily it was about Avraham Avinu, and very little is told in the Torah about Yitzchak Avinu, and maybe at some future share we will discuss this interesting phenomena. We learn at great length about Avraham Avinu, about Yaakov Avinu, and especially about the story of Yosef and his brothers. Very little is related about Yitzchak Avinu, but this week's parsha is about Yaakov and Esav. V'yehav Yitzchak es Esav ki tzayid bepiv. And the Onkelos writes with more detail, V'rochem Yitzchak es Esav arei mitzedei have ochel. So Esav was the one that took care of his father and saw to it that his father has what to eat. And in Yordei Makuf Yutes, we find a fundamental halacha that a person that is not shoyme Kashrus is not reliable regarding to Kashrus. If the person himself isn't diligent and he eats non-kosher food, how could you rely on him when it comes to Kashrus? So the Gemara in Kedushin, Daf Yud Chesed Amud Aleph, that is source number 4, the Gemara says that Esav was a Yisor Mumar. And in Cholan Daf Hey, the Gemara says, Shchitas Mumar Posul. So how did Yitzchak eat the Shchita of Yaakov Avinu? And not only the Shchita, how did he rely? When Esav brings him a steak or any other meat, how do you rely on Esav? Was this a kosher animal or a non-kosher animal? So, that was before Matan Torah. But twice in Shas, Chazal teach us, Kiem Avraham Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula Ad Shelo Nitno. Who remembers where that Gemara is? Does anybody remember? That Avraham Avinu was observant and he kept all the mitzvahs even though it was way before Matan Torah. Anybody remember the Gemara? Twice in Shas, Kedushin Pei Beis, at the end of Masechet Kedushin, and in Yom Edav Chaf Ches. So Avraham Avinu kept all the mitzvahs before they were given. So how does he rely on Esav? Ve'im timtze loimer, Yitzchak wasn't aware. What could he do? Yitzchak thought that Esav is a big tzaddik. He loved Esav. But the Gemara also says many times in Shas, Behemton shel tzadikim eina kodesh baruch hu mevi takala al yadam, tzadikim atzmam lo kol sheken. So it's very unreasonable to assume that Yitzchak was nichshal. So all these questions goes without saying are b'derech drash. Yismach Moshe. And who knows who was the Yismach Moshe? Who was the Yismach Moshe? What? He started Satmar. Not exactly Satmar, but yeah. The first stage of the evolution of Satmar, the Yismach Moshe was a Moshe Teitelbaum. And Seged, Satmar, all the Teitelbaums are descendants of the Yismach Moshe. So was the Kloisenberger Rebbe. Many Halbishtams are descendants of the Yismach Moshe. And he was a huge gadol. He has Shalosh Teshuvos Heishav Moshe, which is an amazing sefer. And he has a beautiful drash. So the story of the Yismach Moshe is this. Esav was a Rosha. And the Gemara clearly says in Kedushin Yud Ches, he was a Mumar. However, there was one mitzvah in which he was very, very makpid, and that's Kvoid Av Ve'em. He was very respectful of his father, and he cared for his father. And Esav, growing up in the home of the Gadol Ador of Yitzchak Avinu, knew that Yitzchak can't eat his shchita. So whenever he caught an animal out in the woods, he brought it home and he asked Yaakov to be the shoichet. So Yaakov was the shoichet, and Esav was the hunter. Now the Yismach Moshe writes a surprising idea, And he says, a big tzaddik, when he eats meat, he could feel the Yiras Shamayim of the Shoichet. When he eats meat, he doesn't know exactly who the Shoichet was it Reuven or Shimon or Levi or Yehuda, but he does feel how much Yiras Shamayim went into the Shechita. And that is why Yitzchak loved Esav. And all the Lashon Haras that people said about Esav just caused Yitzchak to appreciate him more and more. What a tzaddik nistar. You can't tell me any stories. I eat his shechita. Yitzchak said, and I know what a tzaddik he is. When I eat what he brings me, the meat that he brings me, I feel a tam gan Eden. So everybody talked awful things about Esav. He's a bad person, he's a mumar, and Yitzchak was amazed how Esav is successful in concealing his tzidkus. And he's a tzaddik nistar. The first time it happened, it transpired, it came to be, Esav brings his animals from the woods and he doesn't find his shoichet. And Yaakov is nowhere to be found. When was that? And the fateful day when Yaakov stole his brahas. So Yaakov goes into hiding. He's afraid to confront Esav. Esav comes home. Where's my shoichet? Doesn't find his shoichet. So he shechted, first time in the history that he'd shechita himself. And then he comes into Yaakov, and into Yitzchak, and Yitzchak asks him, who are you? And he says, I'm Esav. I bring you food every day. And suddenly Yitzchak is terrified. So the guy that was here before, and he brought me food, that's not you? So who is he? When I ate my meal an hour ago, I felt the Tam Gan Eden. And that's not you? So what's the story? And suddenly Yitzchak realizes that he made a mistake all these years when he thought Esav is this big tzaddik. Vayecharad Yitzchak charode gedoylo. Not only about the brachas, but about all these years that he was so convinced that his son Esav is the biggest of tzaddikim. So that's a spark of genius from the Yismach Moshe. It's a drash, but going back to the fundamental question, Shchitas Mumer Posul, the Gemara in Chulin Daf Hey explains, why is Shchitas Mumer Posul? Because he is not a bar zvicha. And I say, you cannot be a bar zvicha before the mitzvah of Shchita was given. Before the mitzvah of Shchita was given, before Matan Torah, neither could you be a bar zvicha, nor could you be someone that is einoi bar zvicha, because the mitzvah of zvicha, which is the mitzvah of Shchita, was not yet given. So even though Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov observed the mitzvahs before they were given, but it cannot be all the protim and all the halachas, because the psul of a mumar is, he is not a bar zvicha. But before Matan Torah, no one was a bar zvicha, because zvicha was not yet given. And that would be my approach regarding this question. Most of our sources today deal with the psak of Rav Moshe Feinstein. And I'm a great admirer of Rav Moshe, and there's nothing special about me being a great admirer of Rav Moshe. Everyone is a great admirer of Rav Moshe because he was the Gadol Hador. And Rav Moshe was very original in psak, and he was very original and very brave in psak. And he has a gewaldige chiddush. Could a person rely on personal conviction when it comes to Kashrus? So Rav Moshe deals with the situation, and I've been asked the same question, the same shaila 100 times, but Baruch Hashem, the other way around, because we're living in an amazing time. So Rav Moshe deals with the question, source number 7. Behoyosi b'Moskva b'shnas Tov Reish Tzadik Daled. goes back 92 years, pre-Holocaust Russia. And in those days, under the communist regime, many of the elderly members of the community were from. But their children, none of them were from, after decades of communism, of Bolshevism. And Moshe was asked by the parents who were medactic b'mitzvahs, could we eat by our children? Their children were no longer shomer Torah. And we started today's shiur with the sif in Yoredei Mekuf Yutes. Achoshed ala dover einoi meyadolav. You cannot rely on a person that for himself doesn't keep Kashrus. But the parents said, we know our children. My son, my daughter won't do this to me. And I know that I could rely on my kids. They respect their parents. And if they say, all the food that we are serving is 100% kosher, could a person rely on his personal conviction? And Moshe says yes. Even though according to fundamental halacha, these kids are not reliable because they don't keep kashrus for themselves. But if the parent is convinced, I trust my son, my daughter, they could rely on personal conviction. So the same question I was asked so many times, but the other way around, by parents that are not from, and their children b'choyze b'tshuva, and the children ask, could we spend Shabbos with our parents that so much want us to come over for a meal, but the parents aren't shomer Torah, and the children say, I know my mother, I know my father, and I am 100% sure that I could rely on them. So the fundamental question is, could a person rely in kashrus on his personal conviction, even though according to fundamental halacha, there was no one to rely on? And the Moshe says yes, and he wants to prove his point from a Gemara in Ksubis, Daf Pei Hey. So let's go over to source number 9. Ha'i hitza the Echayve Shviya Beidine de Rava. A woman had a case in the basin of Rava, and she was Chayiv Shavua. Omrele Basar of Chizda, the daughter of Rav Chizda, tells Rava, I know this lady, and you can't rely on her Shavua. She swears all the time, whether it's true or not. There's halacha and Dina Mu'min, when a person is Chayiv Shavua, but Beis know that you can't rely on his Shavua, then we put the Shavua on the other party. So instead of the defendant swearing that I do not need to pay, the claimant swears, I am saying the truth, and I deserve to be paid. Who was Basar of Chizda? Does anybody know who her husband was? Who was the husband of Bas Rav Chizda? Who was the son-in-law of Rav Chizda? That was Rava. So why does Rava say Bas Rav Chizda? Rava means to say, my wife is such a tzaddik, not because she's my wife. Not because she's an Eishes Chova, but because she's a Bas Talmud Chacham, and she grew up in the home of Rav Chizda, and that's where her integrity comes from. So Bas Rav Chizda, Rava's wife tells him, this woman is unreliable, and he puts the Shavua on the other party. Zimnin Haviyas v'kamei Rav Papa v'Rav Ada Bar Masna. Rav Papa and Rav Ada Bar Masna sit with Rava, Aisa Ishtora Gabei, Omer Rav Papa, Yadana Beid Ishtora Priyehu. So Rav Papa tells Rava, this shtar is a false shtar, it was already paid. And Rava asks Rav Papa, are you the only witness, or is somebody else here together with you? Because if you're an Eid Echad is not Ne'eman B'dina Mu'minis. I cannot rely on you. Omelei lo, I'm here on my own. Omelei, so Rava tells Rav Papa, Afragav de Ikamar Ed Echad Lav Klumo. One witness means nothing. Omelei Rav Ada Bar Masna. Rav Ada Bar Masna challenges Rava, and he says, I was here last week, and you relied on your wife, even though she was an ed echod and a psula le'edus. Rav Papa, our friend, one of the greatest gedolim of our time, is less reliable than your wife. Rav Adam Masna asks Rav Papa, V'lo yehi Rav Papa kebas Rav Chizda, and Rava says, Bas Rav Chizda kimli bigava, ma lo kimli bigavei. Rava responds and he says, I know the daughter of Rav Chizda, and I trust her because I know her personally. She will never lie. I don't know Rav Papa well enough. He's one of the Gedolei Hador. But the Yesod is personal conviction. The fact that somebody is a huge Talmid Chochem doesn't give him more reliability than any other witness. Bas Rav Chizda, I know her intimately, I know her personally, she will never lie. The fact that you're a huge Talmid Chochem doesn't mean that you can never lie. So this is somewhat of a shocking Gemara. And then the Gemara goes on, Omer of Papa, Hashte the Omer mar kimli bigavei miltahi, kigon abe Mary bri. Rav Papa says, I have a son, Abba Mary, the kimli bigavei. Karanish tarapumei, karanas akadatach, and omeranish tarapumei. So Rav Papa hears Rava, and he says, wow, it is all about personal conviction, then I think I could trust my son was Abba Mary. And if I have a case in Beis Din, and a shtar would come before us, and Abba Mary would say, this is a shtar mezuyaf, I would tear up the shtar and throw it in the garbage. And the Gemara says, no. There's a limit to the validity of personal conviction. Lahafoch shvuah l'tzaddik keneged, ken. To tear a shtar, no. So Rav Moshe wants to prove from this Gemara, personal conviction means something, and therefore a person could rely on personal conviction when it comes to Kashrus. I think this raya is questionable. Because at the end of the day, the Gemara does say that the validity of personal conviction is limited. You cannot tear a shtar. You could be mahapach shavua al hatzad hasheni. So where do we put relying on kashrus besveiket diuraisa? Would that be like hefech shavua, or would it be like kriyas hashtar? How would we know? Dina momentus are a totally different realm than kashrus. So how could this Gemara be a source that a person should rely on personal conviction when it comes to a sveika diuraisa in kashrus? There is a similar Gemara, and that's source number 10 in Yevomis. Omer Rav Yehuda kegon Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda mafikna mamoina apumei. Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda is such a trustworthy person, even though he's an ed echod, I would be moitzi mamoin. And the Gemara once again asks, mafikna? Al pi shnei eidem omer Rachmoni. You need shnei eidem. Ela maranish Torah apumei. So the Gemara in Yevomis is similar to the second case in Ksubis. Marana shtora apumei. I wouldn't rip the shtar to shreds and throw it away, but I would say you need to prove that this document is authentic. You need to prove. And the proof is upon you. So this namonis is limited, as we see in both Gemaras. So on one hand, by Kashrus, you don't need Shnei Eidim, Ed Echod Neiman B'Yisurin. But on the other hand, how would we know Kashrus is compared to what? To Heifech Shavua? Maranish Torah? Karanish Torah? How would we know? So this source is somewhat questionable. So the first tshuva that Moshe deals with parents and children. The other tshuva that Moshe deals with a more problematic case. Person that not showing the Torah mitzvahs. And he sells food. He has a butcher shop. And the people rely on him, generally. Is he reliable when it comes to Kashrus? And this case, in my eyes, is far more problematic. Because when a family member says, I trust my mom, I trust my children, that is a totally different level of conviction and trust than residents of a little town that trust the butcher. That is not real personal conviction and personal knowledge. So in the second tshuva, number 8 on our sheet, that Moshe argues, it is only family members that you could trust, because it is only within the family that people know each other in such a personal way, in such an intimate way, that they could say, I know my father, I know my son, and they would never lie. I question whether this halacha is dafka by family members. Doesn't seem so in both Gemaras that we quoted. Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda was not related to Rav Yehuda, and Rav Papa was not related to Rava. And when Rav Ada bar Masna asks Rava, isn't Rav Papa as reliable as your wife? Why doesn't the Rava simply respond, but he's not a relative? He says, I don't know Rav Papa well enough. So according to the Moshe, it is a shtickle doichek to say that that is actually what Rava is saying. Rav Papa is not my relative, and therefore I don't know him well enough. So I think this halacha would not be confined after to family members, but definitely you need a very personal and intimate relationship to say, I know him well enough. And that does not apply to a butcher and all members of community. Yes, basically he's an honest man. He never stole, he never robbed, he never cheated. That is not enough to override a halacha that hachoshed ala davar einoi meid olav. So, this is an interesting psak, and because this shiur is never based on halacha l'maisa, I agree with Moshe's fundamental psak, and that is a huge discussion in Shalosh Teshuvos Minchas Osher Chelek Daled. Don't look for it, because you won't find it, because Chelek Daled is not printed yet, but should be published in the very short future, and that is a lengthy discussion in Shalosh Teshuvos Minchas Osher Chelek Daled. So this week's parsha is fundamentally two stories that have something in common. The beginning of the parsha is about the b'choira, and in the continuation of the parsha, it's about the brahas. And both these stories, when learned lefi pshuton, are somewhat troubling. The Torah describes Yaakov Avinu as a ish tam yoshev oholam, the most honest and innocent person. And this week's parsha does not seem to be so innocent or so honest. The story of the b'choira, Yaakov is taking advantage of Esav's desperation. Esav comes home from the field and he's going to faint. And he tells Yaakov, I'm dying. Give me something to drink. And Yaakov says, oh, my dear beloved brother, I'm so happy to help you, but first sign this document. And Esav says, what am I signing? First give me something to drink. And Esav says, no, just wait a moment. Sign, please sign here. And Esav asks, what is it? And Yaakov says, it's just about the b'choira. Sign and I'll give you to drink. If Yaakov and Esav would come to my Beis Din, and Esav would say, this transaction is not valid, I wasn't in a proper state of mind. He took advantage of my desperation. I thought I'm going to die. I would probably rule in favor of Esav and invalidate this case based on a Gemara in Yevomis Kuvov Amid Aleph. I don't have time to explain the Gemara. Look it up. And you'll see why I think that this transaction is questionable. And then we come to the other story, which is even more troubling. A conspiration between Rivka and Yaakov to fool this old, blind tzaddik and get the brachas out of him in a totally dishonest way. So am I questioning Yaakov Avinu's tzidkus? No. We need to learn this parsha with the Zohar. And when we learn the Zohar, everything falls into place. And the Zohar explains, why does Yaakov need the Bechorah? It's not because he wants a double portion of the Yerisha. No. It's not even about the Karbonas, like Rashi explains. The only reason Yaakov needs the Bechorah because he knows that the brachas are designated for the Bechorah. And bracha and Bechorah are the same letters. And they come together, two sides of the same coin. And Yaakov Avinu also knows that he is the Bechorah because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says in his Torah, B'ni Bechorah Yisrael. He just needs to get Esav out of the way. Why does he need the Bechorah? Doesn't need the Bechorah, he needs the brachas. And why does Yaakov need the brachas? The Zohar explains that Yaakov was blessed during his lifetime 4 times. The most important brachas are this week's parsha. The brachas that Yitzchak bestowed on Yaakov, thinking he's Esav. At the end of this week's parsha, when Yitzchak sends Yaakov back to Lavan, Vayavorech Oisoi. Next week's parsha, when Yaakov is on the way to Padan Aram, Nigla Elav HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he had a revelation and HaKadosh Baruch Hu benches him. And finally, in Parshas Yitzchak, when Yaakov fights the Malach, Sorei Shel Esav, and the Malach says, Shalcheni, and Yaakov says, no, you're going nowhere. Lo yeshalechecha, ki im berechtoni, and Sorei Shel Esav benches Yaakov. Says the Zohar, Yaakov had a difficult life. He needed to cope with Lavan, then with Esav. Bikesh Yaakov leisha b'shalva v'kofetz ola rugzoi shel Yosef. Yaakov has amazing brachas, but he doesn't want to touch them. For his own sake, he takes the lesser brachas. And that was the second time Yitzchak benched him when he sent him back to Lavan. What about the other 3 brachas? Those brachas are for Klal Yisrael. And Klal Yisrael was zoichet to Geulas Mitzrayim and Binyan Abayis Arishan in the merit of one of the brachas Yaakov gave us. We were zoichet to Geulas Bavel and Bayis Sheni in the schus of the second bracha Yaakov gave us. And the major brachas are still pending. And it is those brachas that will ensure that we make it l'keitz hayamin to bias Moshiach Tzedkenu and to binyan bayis hashlishi. So when Yaakov is afraid and he says, Ulai yemishani ovi ve'vesi alai klala, Rivka says, Olai kilalaschu beni, and the Targum Unkala says, this is nevuah. This is Ruach HaKodesh. This is the way it needs to be. And this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's master plan. And it is the only way Klal Yisrael will make it to the finishing line. It is the only way we could be zoichet to the Geula Shalema. These brachas. And this is the way it needs to be. So when we learn the Zohar, Yaakov had no personal interest or benefit from these stories. This is Das Elyon. This is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan from day one. And this is the way it needs to be. And Yaakov does what he does against his personal inclination, despite he was an Ishtam Yoshev Aholim. This is Ruach HaKodesh, and this is the way it needs to be. I have one little addition to the Zohar. Could we understand why this is the way it needs to be? Why does a Kodesh Baruch Hu impose on Yaakov something that goes totally against who he is? Why? My feeling is this. Tomorrow Shabbos we read in the Haftarah, Ahavti eschem ne'um Hashem, v'amartem b'me'ahavtoni, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Yaakov and Esav are brothers, v'ohev es Yaakov es Esav suneisi. A time will come in which it might not be obvious who's Yaakov and who's Esav. A time might come in which there won't be such a huge difference between Yaakov and Esav. And we already knew a time like that. By Kriyas Yamsef, the Medrash says, Sarah Shalyam said, I don't see any difference between these and those. Why? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you split and don't ask why. This is the way I want it. So a time might come, wouldn't be so obvious who deserves and who does not. Today, Baruch Hashem, we're living in an amazing day and age, and Torah is flourishing and Torah is blossoming, but still the majority of Jews in the world don't even want to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And there are thousands of Jews in America demonstrating with the Palestinians against Israel and against Jews. And it is a substantial Jewish vote that brought whoever they brought to New York. So not always will it be obvious exactly who's Yaakov and who's Esav and who deserves to be redeemed and who does not. And that is why these brahas were bestowed upon Yaakov when he looked like Esav. And Yitzchak actually thought that he is Esav, and he gave him these brachas. This is the way it needed to be. So this parsha we need to learn with the Zohar. It's nothing about Yaakov. He goes against his feelings, against who he is, but this is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted it to be. And we will be Zocher B'Korov to the Geula Shalema, only in the merit of these brachas of this week's parsha that Yaakov achieved instead of Esav. So let us hope that B'Korov B'Yameinu, these brachas will be fulfilled, and we should be Zocher in the schus of Yaakov Avinu and his brachas to a Geula Shalema, or Voratzi and Goyal, and we should see Pnei Moshiach Tzedkenu B'Mheirav Yameinu Amen. Have a beautiful Shabbos.